The morning Ashton Mercer announced in front of 43 employees that he was terminating Odessa Nkomo's consulting contract, not a single person in the room spoke. He stood at the head of the glass-walled boardroom on the 22nd floor of Meridian Logistics Group's Calgary headquarters. His fitted blazer, just a shade darker than the Alberta sky through the windows behind him. And he said it with the confident ease of someone who had never once been wrong in a room and expected to continue that pattern indefinitely. He told the assembled staff that Meridian needed rigorous, data-driven solutions, not instinct-based assessments from outside consultants, no matter how well regarded that consultant might be in certain circles. Odessa sat at the far end of the long table. She was 47 years old, and she had built a company worth $2 billion from a basement apartment in Brampton, with a laptop that kept overheating and a router she'd borrowed from her neighbor. She wore a plain navy blazer and no jewelry beyond a simple watch. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the glass of water in front of her. She simply closed the leather portfolio on the table, set her pen beside it without a sound, and waited for him to finish. Ashton told the room he had assembled a team of 11 specialists, all of them holding doctorates from institutions most people in that boardroom would never attend. He had flown them in from Montreal, from Vancouver, from Toronto and Edinburgh and Zurich. Each one came with a research portfolio that ran longer than most novels. He presented them almost as a correction, as though Odessa's presence at Meridian had been a miscalculation that was now being properly addressed. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked relieved. The 43 people in that room looked mostly at the table. Odessa stood when he finished, buttoned her blazer with 2 quiet movements, and nodded once toward the younger analysts who had been working alongside her for the past 3 weeks. She told them, calmly and without drama, that the raw failure logs from the May deployment were in the shared drive, and that whoever picked up the work should start there before touching anything in the model's waiting architecture. Nobody wrote it down. One junior analyst looked as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words in time. Then Odessa Nkomo walked out of that boardroom, down 22 floors, through the lobby of the tallest office building in that part of Calgary, and the doors closed behind her in the kind of silence that doesn't fully lift for days. Meridian Logistics Group had been operating for 26 years, long enough to have built a reputation as one of the steadiest freight and supply chain management companies in Western Canada. It was the kind of company that provincial governments trusted with sensitive infrastructure contracts, and that corporate partners called reliable, in the way you'd describe a bridge you'd been crossing safely for 2 decades. The man now running it was 33 years old. Ashton Mercer had inherited operational control from his father 18 months earlier through a series of board-level maneuvers that the older senior staff had watched with the resigned weariness of people who understood exactly what was happening and had no effective way to stop it. He had 3 degrees, all of them excellent, and he had ideas about automation and artificial intelligence that he genuinely believed in with a fervor most people reserved for things they had experienced firsthand rather than read about in depth. He was not unintelligent. He was simply a man who had spent his entire adult life in institutions that confirmed his brilliance on a schedule, and had never spent a meaningful amount of time in a room where someone quietly knew more than he did. The algorithm he'd commissioned was supposed to be the proof of everything he believed. A fully AI-driven routing and load distribution system that would replace 3 separate legacy programs Meridian had been running since the late 1990s. The project had cost just over $300 million than projected, but Ashton had remained publicly confident at every stage. He called it Meridian Atlas. He called it Meridian Atlas. He said it would set the standard for supply chain intelligence in North America. The federal government contract it was supposed to power was worth over $400 million and covered emergency medical supply routing for 6 provinces. It was the largest contract Meridian had ever held. The deployment window was fixed. The first real-world demonstration, scheduled in front of government procurement officers and department heads, was 8 weeks away. Meridian Atlas had been failing quietly and irregularly for 11 weeks. Not catastrophically, not in ways that triggered alarms on the dashboards. The failures were subtle, the kind of thing that looked like minor latency spikes until someone ran a longitudinal comparison and noticed the pattern. The system would perform flawlessly for days, then produce a cascade of routing miscalculations so small in isolation that no single one would have raised a flag, but so consistent in aggregate that a real-world deployment would have sent emergency medical shipments to the wrong distribution nodes across 4 provinces simultaneously. Odessa Nkomo had been brought in 6 weeks earlier because nobody else had found the problem. She had not come from within the logistics industry. She had built her name in predictive systems architecture, working with everything from urban transit algorithms to financial risk modeling. Always with the same approach. She went to the raw data first, before the dashboards, before the cleaned outputs, before the summary reports that other people had already decided how to interpret. Her company, Nkomo Analytics, operated out of a quiet building in Toronto's East End and employed fewer than 90 people, none of whom had been hired for the names on their diplomas. She had started it at 24 years old, after leaving a position at a data firm in Mississauga, under circumstances she had never discussed publicly. She held 7 patents under her own name, had 2 papers in obscure technical journals that a small number of specialists considered essential reading, and kept her client list private. She was worth just over $2 billion and lived in a house in the Beaches neighborhood that her neighbors sometimes assumed belonged to a retired teacher. She had looked at Meridian Atlas for 4 days before she said anything useful. When she did, she said it quietly, in a document shared to the engineering team's folder, 3 pages long, written in plain language that required no translation. The problem, she wrote, was in the weighting assigned to a variable the model used to estimate buffer time between handoff nodes. The number was 0.73. It needed to be 0.68. The difference looked trivial on a spreadsheet. In practice, under real-world load conditions across 6 provinces, the compounding effect of that 0.05 gap produced a drift in the system's timing logic that accumulated across deployment cycles until it hit a threshold the model couldn't self-correct. She had seen the exact same error pattern in a failed startup system 15 years ago in Waterloo. She explained in 2 paragraphs exactly why it happened and what changing the number would do. 3 of the senior engineers read the document. One of them replied by email to say the margin was within accepted variance ranges and that her methodology was unclear. Ashton was forwarded the exchange and reached the same conclusion. He had not read her document himself. 2 weeks later, he had terminated her contract in front of 43 people and flown in 11 PhD specialists to start fresh. The 11 specialists arrived on a Tuesday with the confidence of people who have never failed to solve a problem in a controlled environment, and have not yet been inside a room that was not, in the deepest sense, controlled. They ran every diagnostic available to them. They rebuilt the model's error-logging infrastructure from scratch. They ran simulation cycles in the hundreds. They brought in additional cloud computing resources and ran the deployment test on virtual environments mimicking each province's specific network conditions. Every single test came back clean. Then they ran a staged test with partial live data, and Meridian Atlas collapsed exactly as it had before. The team lead, a tall man from Edinburgh with a CV that filled 4 pages, insisted the fault had to be in the data pipeline, not the model itself. Spent 9 days rebuilding the pipeline. The next test produced the same result. A researcher from Montreal proposed the issue was in the handshake protocol between Atlas and Meridian's legacy inventory system. They re-architected the handshake. Another failure. An engineer from Zurich stayed in the office until 2 in the morning, 4 nights in a row, running variance analyses across every weighted parameter in the model. He produced a 40-page report documenting every finding. The report was thorough and detailed and said nothing useful about what was actually wrong. Ashton, watching from his office on the 22nd floor, felt the first real crack in his certainty appear sometime in the third week. He had promised the board a solution within a month. That month had passed. He had promised the federal procurement team that any issues would be resolved well ahead of the demonstration date. The demonstration was now less than 5 weeks away. He began sending messages through his assistant every few hours, asking for updates, which the 11 specialists received and answered in ways that said nothing, with great technical precision. Late on a Thursday night, he received a call from the chair of Meridian's board of directors, an older woman who had known his father for 30 years, and who measured her words with the patience of someone who had seen many things go wrong and had no particular interest in watching another. She asked him directly whether what she was hearing from certain quarters was accurate, whether Meridian Atlas was still non-functional 6 weeks before a $400 million federal contract deployment. Ashton told her they were making progress. She thanked him for the update, in a tone that made clear she had not been reassured. He put the phone down and sat for a long time in his empty office, the Calgary skyline dim behind the glass. And for the first time since taking control of the company, he understood that his own judgment, not merely a single algorithm, was being quietly audited. It was Gus Hallett who changed things. Gus was 61 years old and had been with Meridian for 22 of them, most of it spent in the kind of middle-distance role that never made it into annual reports, but that kept things from falling apart. He held the title of Senior Systems Verification Engineer, which meant in practice that he was the person who caught things before they became someone else's crisis. He had been watching the 11 specialists work from a respectful distance, offering nothing, asking for nothing, doing his own job quietly alongside theirs. One evening, while the rest of the 18th floor had gone dark, Gus sat down with a stack of folders nobody had touched since Odessa's departure. Inside them were printouts of everything she had submitted during her 6 weeks at Meridian, including documents shared to the team folder that had, to all appearances, never been opened a second time. He read her 3-page memo in 20 minutes. Then he read it again. He pulled up the model's architecture files, found the weighting table she had referenced, located the variable she had named. He read her explanation of the compounding drift mechanism. He read it a third time, slowly. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. He had worked with enough systems over 22 years to know when something was right. Not in the way you know when an equation balances, but in the way you know when someone has looked at a problem from the angle that reveals its actual shape rather than its shadow. Odessa had done that. She had written it down in 3 pages, and nobody had listened. Gus spent the rest of that night going through the records the way you might pull thread until a whole hem comes loose. He found that Odessa had flagged 3 related anomalies in smaller notes appended to the same document. He found that the one engineer who had replied by email dismissing her methodology had done so 11 minutes after the document was shared. Not enough time to have read it with any care. He found that Ashton had been forwarded that reply and had marked it resolved. He went home. He came back the next morning. He requested a meeting with Ashton Mercer. He laid 2 printed pages on the polished desk and waited while Ashton read them, watching the younger man's face move through a progression of expressions that ended somewhere between tight-jawed and very still. Ashton asked where Odessa Nkomo was now. It took 3 days to find out. Her Toronto office said she was working, but not on anything connected to Meridian. A junior HR administrator eventually tracked down an old contact at Nkomo Analytics who confirmed that Odessa had returned to her own company and was currently engaged with 2 other clients. She was not unavailable. She was simply no longer looking in Meridian's direction. Ashton flew to Toronto alone. He found the building without difficulty, but waited in the lobby for 20 minutes before asking the receptionist to let her know he was there. He had not called ahead. He had been afraid, in a way he didn't fully examine, that she would simply decline. She came down herself rather than sending someone. She wore the same kind of plain blazer she had worn in Calgary, and she looked at him with an expression that was not hostile and not warm. She said they could talk in the small meeting room off the lobby. He told her what had happened. The 11 specialists, the 9 weeks of failure, the federal contract, and the demonstration date now 4 weeks out. He said, Meridian needed her back. He said it simply and without the language of persuasion, because somewhere on the flight from Calgary, he had understood that persuasion was not the right tool for this particular room. She listened without speaking. Then she said no. Not with anger. Not with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to say it. Just clearly, the way you state a fact. He asked her why she hadn't fought back. When he'd terminated her contract in that boardroom, with 43 people watching, she hadn't said a word in her own defense. He wanted to understand that, and the question came out more honestly than he had intended. She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him about the job she had left in Mississauga when she was 23 years old. She had been working nights at a data firm, the only black woman on a team of 12, running diagnostic analyses on a predictive failure model for a major infrastructure client. Over 8 months, on her own time, she had developed a method for identifying what she called temporal echo errors, patterns where a model's training data carried a hidden time lag bias that made the system appear accurate in controlled tests and inaccurate in real-world deployment. It was not in any textbook. It was something she had figured out by paying close attention to failures that everyone else attributed to bad data rather than systemic model architecture. She had documented it carefully. She had shared it with her supervisor. Her supervisor had presented it as his own work at a client review. He received a significant bonus and a promotion. She received a handshake in the hallway when no one else was around. She had not filed a complaint. She had not confronted him. She had gone home, thought for 3 weeks, and then resigned and started building her own company. She told Ashton this without bitterness and without drama, the way you might describe weather you've already dressed for. She told him she had not stayed silent in that Meridian boardroom out of weakness. She had stayed silent because she had already done her work. It was documented, and whatever happened next would say nothing useful about her that wasn't already visible to anyone willing to look. She said the 3-page memo was still in the shared drive. The information had been there. She had not taken it with her when she left. Ashton sat with that for a while. He asked her, before he stood to leave, whether she had ever regretted not speaking up sooner. Not just at Meridian, but across her whole career, all the time she had let things pass without a fight. She told him the question assumed that silence was the same as absence, that there was a difference between not arguing and not acting. She had never stopped working. She had never stopped documenting. She had never stopped building something that belonged entirely to her. The only thing she had ever regretted, she said, was the time she spent in other people's buildings instead of her own. He flew back to Calgary. 3 days later, he returned to Toronto. She was not there. She was at a client site in Waterloo. He drove to Waterloo. She saw him through the glass wall of the conference room and came out without being called. They stood in a corridor that smelled of coffee and printer paper, and she crossed her arms and waited. He told her he wasn't there to offer her more money. He wasn't there to offer her a different title or a larger contract. He said he had thought carefully about what he wanted to ask, and that what he wanted to ask was simply whether she would come back, not as a consultant he could dismiss, but as a partner in fixing what he had broken. She told him that if she came back, she had one condition: no salary adjustment, no new designation. What she wanted was for Meridian to commission an independent review of every member of its technical staff who had been passed over for promotion in the previous 5 years. 18 people, by the count she had made during her 6 weeks there. She wanted their performance records evaluated by criteria that included demonstrated problem-solving outcomes, not only educational credentials and years in title. She wanted the results made actionable, not filed in a drawer. She said she did not expect him to fully understand why that mattered to her more than money. But she expected him to agree to it anyway and to follow through on it, whether she was watching or not. He agreed without hesitation. She looked at him for a moment longer, assessing something she didn't explain. Then she told him she would be at Meridian's Calgary office the following Monday morning. When Odessa walked back into the Meridian building that Monday, the lobby attendant recognized her immediately and waved her through before she reached the security desk. Word had moved through the building over the weekend in the way that significant things travel through offices. Not officially, not on any calendar, but thoroughly. By the time she reached the 18th floor, the 11 specialists had arranged themselves around the room with the quiet focus of people who had been preparing for this moment and weren't entirely certain what it meant. Gus Hallett stood near the window with his arms folded. He nodded when she came in. She said, "Good morning." Then she crossed to the main terminal, sat down, and asked for the current deployment build to be pulled up. Nobody spoke. One of the specialists moved to assist. She looked at the architecture for 11 minutes. Not performing, not narrating what she was doing. Just looking. The way you look at something when you already understand its language and are simply confirming what you already know. Then she asked the specialist beside her to open the waiting configuration file. He opened it. She asked him to locate the buffer time variable for handoff node estimation. He found it. The value read 0.73. She told him to change it to 0.68. The specialist hesitated. The Edinburgh team lead across the room started to say something about variance thresholds. Odessa looked at him briefly, not unkindly, and said she understood his concern and that he should run the test first and raise the objection afterward if the result warranted it. The change took 4 seconds to implement. The deployment test took 6 minutes to run. Meridian Atlas performed without a single error. The room went very still. One of the younger specialists, a researcher from Vancouver, who had been at Meridian for 5 of those 11 weeks and had not slept a full night in most of them, sat back slowly in her chair and looked at the screen for a long time without saying anything. Someone else let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since well before this morning. Gus stood by the window with the same expression he'd worn when he'd first read Odessa's memo. The particular stillness of someone confirming what they already knew was true. Ashton watched from the glass partition at the edge of the floor. He did not go into the room. He stood where he was, watching a woman he had publicly dismissed stand calmly beside a system that had defeated every credentialed specialist his money could assemble, and he felt something settle in his chest that was not quite relief and not quite shame, but something compound and necessary made of both. 3 days before the federal demonstration, Ashton called an all-staff meeting in the same boardroom where he had terminated Odessa's contract 4 months earlier. He came without notes. He told the room that he had made a judgment call that had nearly cost the company a $400 million contract and had cost the team 11 weeks of unnecessary failure and the kind of damage to professional confidence that takes longer to repair than a deadline calendar can measure. He said he had assessed Odessa Nkomo's worth using criteria that had nothing to do with her actual ability. He said he had done it quickly and confidently, and without asking the one question that would have made the answer obvious. What does this person's work actually show? He said the company was going to change how it evaluated people. He named the 18 employees Odessa had identified and told the room the independent review would begin the following week. He said he was not asking for credit for correcting a mistake he had made. He was simply telling them what was going to happen. The room received it the way people receive something rare. with the kind of quiet that isn't empty. The 11 PhD specialists, rather than feeling diminished by what had happened, did something that surprised most of the people watching. One by one, over the days that followed, they came to find Odessa, not to explain themselves, but to ask questions. The Edinburgh team lead came first, on a morning when she was working quietly at the workstation she had been given. He told her plainly that he had been looking at error patterns in adaptive systems for 14 years and had never seen a compounding drift mechanism identified correctly on a first reading. He asked her how she had recognized it. She told him about the Waterloo startup from 15 years ago. The failure pattern she had watched unfold in real time before anyone else had named what was causing it. She told him the most important habit she had ever developed was reading raw failure logs before she read anything that had already been processed into a summary. He took notes. He was not too proud to take notes. The demonstration was held on a Thursday morning in early October. The room held government procurement officers, department directors, 2 deputy ministers, and a delegation that had flown in from Ottawa the night before. Meridian Atlas ran the full deployment simulation in front of all of them and performed with a consistency that produced, on the federal team's own monitoring equipment, a reliability score 4 percentage points above the contract's required minimum. Odessa stood near the front of the room alongside the engineering team, answering questions from the government delegates in the direct, plain language manner that had become, over the years, the thing most of her clients remembered longest. She explained what the system did and how it did it and what it would look like under actual deployment conditions. She did not mention the 11 weeks. She did not mention the 4 months. She spoke about the system, as though it had always been something she believed in, because she believed in what it could do when it was given the right conditions. Ashton sat at the back of the room behind the delegation, his hands in his lap, and listened to the woman he had once dismissed from a boardroom describe her work with the same unhurried clarity she had shown from the very first day she walked in. When the demonstration ended and the federal delegates moved into closed session to deliberate, Odessa stayed behind to oversee the shutdown procedure. The room emptied gradually until it was just her and Gus, and 2 of the younger analysts. Gus brought her a coffee from the cart in the hallway. She thanked him. They stood at the edge of the room in a comfortable silence that people share when they have been through something together without needing to describe it to each other. He told her, after a moment, that he should have raised her memo more loudly when it was first shared, that he had read it the same afternoon and believed she was right, but had assumed the team lead would eventually reach the same conclusion. She told him that wasn't his failure to carry. The information had been there. People would either use it or they wouldn't, and in her experience there was a limit to how much you could control which way that went. What you could control was whether you kept producing the information. He nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the long, flat view of Calgary in autumn. He said quietly that it was a good system when it worked the way it was supposed to. She agreed. She set the report down and finished her coffee. The federal contract was formally confirmed the following week. When Ashton called to tell her, she said that was good news. He agreed that it was. He asked her, almost as an afterthought, what she had actually seen in those 11 minutes the first morning, the thing that nothing else had been built to find. She thought about it for a moment. She told him the system had been designed by people who understood how data worked in theory and had built something accurate and rigorous and fundamentally optimistic, designed for a world where inputs would always arrive in the sequence and condition the training data assumed. In the real world, inputs didn't do that. They lagged, they clustered. They reflected the habits of human systems that had never been modeled because nobody had thought to look for them. The 0.05 weighting error wasn't random. It was the exact size of the gap between a model that trusted its own design and a deployment environment that didn't care about design at all. She said an algorithm needed to be built for the world as it actually behaved, not as it was assumed to behave on paper. And that required someone who had spent enough years watching things fail in real conditions to know what failure looked like before the dashboards. Caught it. Ashton carried those words for a long time. He repeated them on difficult days, in meetings where the numbers on the screen seemed more certain than the people generating them, and in moments when he was tempted, as he still sometimes was, to trust the elegance of a model over the testimony of someone who had watched it break. The 18 performance reviews at Meridian were completed the following spring. 11 of those employees received promotions or reassignments based on what the review found. 4 of them were offered roles they had been passed over for twice in the previous 3 years. Ashton announced the results at an all-staff meeting and stood without notes, the same way he had in October, and the room received it with something that felt, to the people who had been there the longest, like the first solid ground in a long time. Odessa Nkomo returned to her building in Toronto's East End, to her team of fewer than 90 people, and her 2 overdue client projects. And she did not speak publicly about what had happened at Meridian. She did not write about it. She came in early, as she always had. She drank her coffee at her desk. She opened the raw failure logs of whatever system she was being asked to look at. And she began at the beginning, and she paid attention. The same way she had paid attention in her father's auto shop as a girl watching him crouch beside engines older than she was. And later in that basement apartment in Brampton, where she'd first understood that the difference between a system that failed and a system that worked was rarely the one thing everyone was looking at, but almost always the small, overlooked thing quietly waiting to be seen.